Now, one of the biggest fears people have when it comes to retiring is not knowing if they're going to have enough money. They spent their whole working life building up a pension pot, but they have no idea how much income that can actually give them, which can cause a massive problem for people if they don't know what they're doing. So in this video, I'm going to show you an average pension pot size of about £350,000, retiring at age 60, and what this might look like during the course of your retirement. Now, clearly this is slightly larger than the average pension pot size in the UK, but it should give you an idea of what this size pension pot could actually provide in terms of an income if you were to retire at the age of 60. But if you're new here, my name's Ben, I'm a chartered financial planner, and my aim is to help as many people as possible gain more clarity and confidence around their personal finances and their retirement. Okay, so before we actually dive into the actual pension pot itself and the sort of income that could produce in retirement, we first need to look at how much income you're likely to need in retirement. So on screen, I've put some figures from the Retirement Living Standards. And this is based on some research done around what a minimum lifestyle in retirement could look like, a moderate lifestyle in retirement, and the comfortable lifestyle in retirement. Now, it's important to know that all of these figures are net of tax. So these are the actual spend figures. And when it comes to the figures, they typically provide them in terms of an annual spend, but quite frankly, I think this is not very relevant or I suppose relatable to people because quite clearly you're used to getting paid monthly. So therefore, I put the figures in terms of the monthly expenses at the bottom too for your reference. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're going to be aiming somewhere around the moderate lifestyle when it comes to retirement. So as you can see, for an individual, that's about £2,600 a month. And that's the figure we'll be using for the purposes of this video. Now, clearly, if you do aim to spend less or more in retirement, that will impact how much you need. But this should still give you a good benchmark as to what level of income that pension pot size could actually produce. Okay, so now we've actually defined what sort of level of income we're likely to need in retirement. We next need to look at the options in terms of how you actually access that pension, because again, I think this is a thing a lot of people misunderstand because quite frankly, we're not taught it at school, we never really learned about it or educated on it. So it's very difficult to actually understand, you spent years and years building up this pension pot, but how do you actually access it when it comes to retirement? Now, there are many different ways you can actually access that pension. But the two main ways are Flexi-Access Drawdown or purchasing an annuity. So when it comes to Flexi-Access Drawdown, you effectively use that pension pot like a bank account. So you can take as much or as little as you want each year. Now, clearly the more you take, the more tax you like to pay. And as a result, that pension pot may well run out sooner. But the benefit of Flexi-Access Drawdown is it means that you can spend more perhaps in the early years of retirement when you're perhaps in better health to actually spend money on things like traveling, etc. And then later on into your retirement, perhaps when your health isn't quite as good, you might spend a bit less. So Flexi-Access Drawdown really gives you, as the name would suggest, that flexibility to take as much or as little as you want, depending on how much you need to fund your lifestyle. And when it comes to the withdrawals, typically you will have 25% of that tax-free. So this is what most people know as the 25% tax-free cash. And then the remaining 75% is taxable, with the rate depending on what your other income is when you retire. But for most people, that's going to be at 20%. Now with an annuity, you take that 25% tax-free cash at one go, and then the remaining pension pot is then provided to an annuity provider. And that annuity provider will then provide you with a guaranteed income for the rest of your life. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that this individual is using Flexi-Access Drawdown to access their pension. And you can see here we've got a fictional example of someone called Flexi-Access Fred. So, as I've said, Fred is actually planning to spend more in the early years of retirement and then probably a bit less in the later years when, as I say, he's probably not going to be in the best of health and he's quite happy just to live day to day without too much travelling or luxuries. And Fred's very happy for his pension to remain invested throughout retirement. So again, this is one thing that people often misunderstand is that when you come to retirement, if you are using Flexi-Access Drawdown, that pension remains invested in the stock market. But depending on the risk that you're willing and prepared to take, this may or may not be an option. But in Fred's case, as I say, he's quite happy to leave that money invested as he's been used to that throughout the course of his working life. And another one of Fred's real key objectives is he wants to leave as much money as possible, or whatever's left in his pension, to his kids on his death. So again, this is one of the benefits of Flexi-Access Drawdown, is that however much money is left in that pension pot when you die can be passed on to your kids or other beneficiaries. Okay, so you can see on screen here, I've mapped out Fred's position from now at age 60 to assumed age of 90. And the reason we use age 90 is because typically as financial planners, although the average life expectancy in the UK is slightly less than this, we want to make sure these plans are robust as possible. So when we're stress testing the numbers, we like to ensure there's sufficient money there within that pension pot to ensure that it remains at age 90. And you can see that Fred's plan is to spend about £30,000 a year from now until age 75. And then when Fred reaches age 75, he's planning to spend about £20,000 a year for the rest of his life. So you can see at the moment there's a massive shortfall. And what this is basically showing is we need to plug that shortfall. So that £30,000 a year from now until age 75, and then £20,000 a year from age 75, as I say, to the assumed age of 90. So the first thing we look at is the state pension. Now, for most people, they're going to be entitled to the full state pension, which, as we stand today, is about £12,500 a year. And that's going to be payable from the age of 68. So you can see here that covers a portion of Fred's expenses from age 68 to age 90. However, there's still a massive shortfall between age 60 and when a state pension starts. And of course, there is still a gap, even once that state pension started, to actually ensure that Fred's expenses can be funded. So how do we actually go about bridging that gap? Now, the first thing we need to talk about is the 25% tax-free cash. Now, as I said earlier on in the video, this is the amount that everyone is entitled to when they start drawing their pension. However, the one key thing that people often overlook is the fact that that 25% doesn't have to be taken as a lump sum at one time. You can take a portion of that tax-free cash allowance each year throughout your retirement. So the example I've given here is you could take £20,000 from your pension, let's say at age 60 when you retire, and of that 20,000, 5,000 will be tax-free, and the remaining 15,000 will be taxable, as I say, likely at 20%. So when we're looking at a pension pot size of £350,000, in theory, your 25% tax-free cash allowance is about £87,500. However, by taking the tax-free cash in increments rather as one lump sum, that remaining tax-free cash actually stays invested. So it can mean that over the course of your retirement, you actually might end up taking more tax-free cash than the £87,500 that you would have got if you took it all as one lump sum. Okay, so now we know that, we can actually start to map out how Fred's expenses might be funded at different phases of his life. So you can see here, from age 60 to age 68, we've got that entire £30,000 of expense being taken from his pension. And you can see we've got £7,500 tax-free cash, and the remaining £22,500 as taxable income. So there you can see the 25% tax-free cash and the 75% taxable income at play, and how that can work in practice. And then we reach age 68, and you can see at that point his state pension comes in, as I say, of £12,500 a year. So instead of having to draw £30,000 a year from his pension, that reduces to £17,500. But again, you can see that we still continue with that same strategy of 25% of that withdrawal being tax-free and 75% being taxable. And then once we reach age 75 and those expenses reduce, again, we've still got that state pension in payment, which means that the amount we need to withdraw from the personal pension, again, is reduced. But again, still 25% tax-free and still 75% as taxable income. Now, clearly this is all based on a theoretical £350,000 pension pot at age 60. But look, I get it, there are so many different variables and factors at play. You might have a defined benefit pension, you might have a slightly larger pension, you might want to retire, let's say at age 62 or 65. So what I would suggest you do is download my free retirement calculator. And you can find the link to this in the description below. And what this allows you to do is you can go in and input your own details. So your current age, what your pension pot size is, how much you ideally want to be spending in retirement, and how much you're saving into your pension on a monthly basis now. And the calculator will show you if you are on track to retire when you want to with the income you want. Now, if you're not on track, it then gives you a few options you might want to consider to ensure you are on track. Okay, so far we've looked at how much income you're likely to need based on a moderate lifestyle in retirement. We've looked at how that could be funded in terms of the strategies with withdrawing money from your pension and how that integrates with the state pension. But how do we know if that's actually sustainable? Will that money run out before we actually get to that age of 90? So on screen now, you can see an example of how this might look in practice from age 60 to age 90. So you can see here the balance of that pension pot based on a 5% annual return within the pension. So you can see that based on that strategy, that pension pot would run out around the age of 88 to 89. So what can we do to actually ensure that is a bit more sustainable? Because clearly we're only a couple of years short here, And as I said, the average life expectancy in the UK is probably around 85, 86. So based on this strategy, it probably would be enough to actually last throughout your life. But what else can we do to actually increase the sustainability of that pension pot? Now, one option we do have is, of course, to reduce the amount the Fred is spending. So let's say instead of spending £30,000 a year from age 60 to age 75, what if we reduce that by £2,000 a year to £28,000? What difference does that make on the trajectory of that pension pot, and does that actually last to the age of 90? So you can see here the difference that makes. So all we've done is reduce the spending by £2,000 a year, which is about £160 a month. So it's not a massive difference, but you can see that the impact this has over the course of Fred's retirement is it actually means in today's terms, he has nearly £100,000 still in that pension when he reaches age 90, which, as I said earlier, he can then pass on to his kids to spend as they want. So this really does show you the impact that actually spending slightly less can have, because we're not in a position where we're cutting Fred's expenses in half. We're only reducing them by £2,000 a year. And that means that instead of his money running out at age 88 or 89, he's actually still got money in his pension when he reaches age 90, which he can then either give to his kids, but obviously if he does live longer than 90, he still knows he's got that buffer there of £100,000 to continue spending throughout the rest of his life. Okay, so the final thing I want to touch on is how do the returns on your pension actually impact on your retirement? So on screen, I've put the average annual returns of various different portfolios from a high growth, a balanced growth, and a low growth over the last 14 to 15 years. And these figures are the net of inflation figures. So you can see just by coincidence, they all end in 0.8. So for high growth, it's been 6.8%. For balanced growth, it's been 4.8%, and for low growth, it's been 2.8%. Now let's actually look at the impact of each different portfolio can have in terms of the sustainability of that pension pot over the course of the retirement. Now, to keep the numbers simple, I've rounded those figures up. So for the low growth portfolio, I've assumed a 3% annual return above inflation. For the balanced growth, I've used that 5% we used previously. And then for the high growth, I've rounded that up to 7% a year net of inflation. And you can see the huge impact this has. So for the low growth portfolio, you're potentially in a position there where that pension pot is running out in your mid-70s. Now, clearly this is not sustainable, which means that we would either have to spend less or perhaps take a slightly higher level of risk with that pension pot to ensure that level of income and expense is actually sustainable throughout your retirement. But the line that your eye is probably drawn to is the high growth one, because in this position, getting that 7% return each year, you're actually in a position where at age 90, you could have a pension pot of £330,000, which is nearly as much as you started with at age 60. And we're not talking about a massive difference in terms of the returns here. It's a 2% a year return from that medium growth to that higher growth. You can see the huge impact this can have over the course of a 30-year retirement. So this is why it's crucial to actually understand what level of risk you're taking with your pension. Now, clearly, look, I get it. Once people stop working and they are very reliant on that pension pot for their income, they are not wanting to take much risk with that. But you can see here that over the course of a 30-year retirement, it can make a massive difference. So it's really important you properly understand the risk you're taking with your pension and the implications of that on the sustainability of your retirement plan. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video and got some value from it. If you did, please do consider subscribing to the channel for more videos just like this in the future. And hopefully I'll see you in the next video.